Hello, Vaughn. It's end of a difficult week for the province, for the country, uh, with the
Yeah.
tragedy in Tumbler Ridge, and it obviously had a ripple effect on everything, including BC politics.
Yeah, it did. And I have to say that our politicians rose to the occasion. There's a scene yesterday outside the legislature around about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and the premier, back from Tumbler Ridge, did a news conference for the news media, press gallery, on what he'd seen and what he'd heard up there, and paid tribute to the resilience of that community and condolences and all that. But the thing that sticks with me is behind him was pretty much every member of the legislature. So not just New Democrats, but conservatives and the Greens, independents, all lined up just there in a show of unity. And not no one's doing it for political reasons, just there. And I was really struck that, I've been doing this for a long time, and I know that at moments our politicians haven't always risen to the occasion. But on this one, they did. They did a moment of silence in the legislature. All three parties agreed, no throne speech. Just bring the lieutenant governor in and have her delivered essentially a very short statement of condolences. And as I said, all of that, look, the grief and agony in that community up there, there's a limit to what you can say and do about it. But I did think that over here in the capital, our political parties responded very well. Nobody played politics. For the premier, you know, in politics, if you go, people say, well, we don't need politicians, you're grandstanding. If you don't go, they say you're not showing, enough for the community. I do think it's important that the premier went up there and that the prime minister is going there. I think it's important. And I don't see it as political grandstanding. What I see it is the community really does need reassurances that the resources they need are going to be there, not just this week, but going down the road and in the future. And so for that reason, I commend all of our politicians, as I said, for rising to the occasion on this.
So now you did get a bit of a backgrounder as well, because the budget will go ahead as
Yeah.
scheduled next Tuesday.
Yeah, the government scrubbed the throne speech for very good reasons, but the throne speech is where the government sets out the agenda for the session. It flags issues, it tells you what's coming, and it's often vague, right? They don't always give you a lot of detail, but it does sort of set the news agenda for the session. So yesterday we got word that they were going to send a couple of staffers to the press gallery to brief us, give us a backgrounder on what will be in the throne speech, or would have been in the throne speech had they delivered it. And it was appreciated. The deal was its background. We couldn't name the officials, we couldn't quote them, but they did give us some kind of a vague sense, just like a throne speech, of what's coming. So the first thing they really wanted to do was they wanted to talk about the budget. So the budget coming Tuesday, they were lowering expectations or discouraging the idea that this was going to be some kind of tough austerity budget. We got the idea that it would be that because the finance minister herself said in a speech 10 days ago or 2 weeks ago that she thought she'd be the least popular person in British Columbia after she brought down the budget, which kind of gave us the idea, oh, this is going to be a tough one. I think the New Democrats realized that that idea had kind of gotten loose out there in the coverage, and maybe we would be going, "Oh, this doesn't sound like austerity at all." So, what they told us was, yes, the deficit is too high, and yes, they are going to try to control spending over time. But this is their emphasis: they are going to continue to work on the program improvements that David Eby brought in when he became premier 4 years or 3 years ago and a bit ago. And they're going to protect core services in government. And the core services are health, both of the education ministries, and the social programs. Well, that's almost the entire budget, right? It was obvious when we heard that this is not going to be it may be tougher than previous NDP budgets, what we get on Tuesday, but it is not something that we will be calling an austerity budget. And if you think of the way David Eby's conducted himself in office since he became premier in November 2022, which is running up the debt and the deficits and the interest payments, I think thinking about it, I don't think anybody should be too surprised that this is not going to be a huge change of direction.
All right. What could be a change is the premier is promising changes to UNDRIP.
Yes, so that was the other thing they wanted us to know, is that the government is sticking with its plan to rewrite the key piece of legislation. It's called the Declaration Act. It was passed by the legislature unanimously in 2019. And what it does is it sets up a system where the province and First Nations will work together over time to rewrite all the laws and policies in the province, to square them, to reconcile them with the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So this is a project that's going to take many years. When they put that legislation through, Harold, they assured the legislature that this does not mean that the courts will immediately be able to jump in and say, oh, this law doesn't live up to this UN declaration, and that law doesn't. They weren't supposed to do that. But this is the government's view. But last December, BC Court of Appeal threw out the system we use in British Columbia to stake mineral claims. They threw it out. They said it was incompatible with UNDRIP. They weren't supposed to do that, but they did it. And I mean, I think, the judges, we hear you, but we've read the legislation. And in our opinion, it does make British Columbia's laws subject to the UN Declaration, and it's not compatible, and they threw out the law. So the government has come out, Harold, and the premier said this, the courts got it wrong, and they're going to rewrite the law to make sure the courts can't do that anymore. Well, we'll see how the judges take to the idea that they shouldn't do something, but what's happened is this has turned into a huge political foofara. First Nations leaders, they've been shown the legislation or the amendments on a non-disclosure agreement, and they pretty much make it clear that they don't like them. In fact, Robert Phillips of the First Nations Summit told our colleague Alec Lazenby last week, he said, I can't really say because I signed a confidentiality agreement what the amendments are, but he then said, we don't like it. It's not what First Nations support. They're going to gut the legislation. And I sort of went, well, thank you for your no comment. That pretty much tells us where it's going. So Harold, in this briefing, we said, First Nations have already seen this legislation and they've rejected it. And, where does that leave the government? And the government is still going to go ahead with the amendments. They're going to amend the legislation in spite of the the Indigenous leaders saying don't change it. And on the other side, we got the Conservatives saying appeal it. Repeal the legislation. Get rid of it. Right. So that's the full range, right? Don't change a word. Get rid of it. And the government in the middle trying to say, look, we think this thing can be amended and saved. That was the only legislation, Harold, that they told us is coming for sure in the session. So and that's the big piece of legislation, we think. So that's really setting up a political battleground for this session. And I think we'll be spending some time covering the implications of this. The government is aware that its whole agenda for dealing with First Nations is under a lot of stress, not just because of this, but because of a way a court dragged private property into the discussions last year, and that's being appealed as well. So this is going to be a major, major subject for the session. I appreciated the briefing on what they told us on what's coming. Yes, it was vague, but Harold, I've covered a lot of throne speeches. They're vague too. And this briefing in that sense, it was pretty good.
Well, you have been critical of the government for their use of NDAs, particularly in relationship with consultation with First Nations, and how in many ways it in some ways makes it worse for First Nations because the public jumps to conclusions. What can you explain to our viewers, like why NDAs in a situation like this?
Well, this is the whole way they operate. Now, there is an issue with legislation being shown to anybody before it's tabled in the legislature. It's a long-standing issue involving the privileges of Parliament and the legislature, that the legislature gets the first look at the legislation. So if they're sharing it around outside to outsiders to get their opinion, that is the basis for a non-disclosure agreement. However, in this case, I think there's more to it than that. First Nations helped draft this legislation. Right. This legislation is itself a product of the new era where the government consults and accommodates First Nations before it does anything. So they're showing it to them, and First Nations are saying, no, we like the way it is. We helped draft it, and we don't want you to change it, and we like what the courts are doing with it. So, there's First Nations leaders who know what's coming. The government knows. Everybody else, including the media, including the opposition, we're guessing. We don't know exactly what these changes are going to say. We now know that they are coming for sure, however, because that's what they told us yesterday.
All right. Thanks, Vaughn. Appreciate it.
Okay, next week we'll have a budget to talk about.
Oh, can't wait. Enjoy your Tuesday. Budget number 3,000 for you, or whatever you're up to now.
Something like that. Yeah. I wasn't here when Premier de Cosmos brought in his budget, but I have been around for a while.
All right,
Thank you.
Again. Bye-bye.
Okay. Bye-bye.